Mike is calling in via probably the internets from South Carolina. He, him. Questions for Cross and I assume Ryan about, and this is why I took this because I'm very curious about the Fair Housing Act.
Oh.
So neither of us are necessarily that type of attorney, but glad to field the question. Asterisk, all of this is hypothetical. We are not giving any legal advice. So go ahead, Mike. What's your question?
Hey, good to talk to you guys, and thanks for taking the question. The reason is just cut to the chase. I know you had a lot of calls already. I had a conversation with Forrest a couple weeks ago, and he said, hey, one point in the conversation, he goes, look, this is Forrest talking. He said, hey, I live in Oklahoma, and it's so backwards out here that if you're homosexual or I guess queer or whatever, and you're renting a property, he said you can literally get thrown out if that is your situation.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like in disbelief. I was like, well, what year is this? You know, and I go, that's not right. And because of a sexual orientation, there's a whole list of other reasons. But then,
sure,
you know, so I dug into it a bit, and there's the fair housing that got passed by HUD back in 2021, and I'm thinking it's a federal law, and it specifically says you can't do things like that. So is Forrest correct, or is it a blue law that nobody enforces?
That is a great question. That is a wonderful question. Are you a fan of Game of Thrones?
A little bit. Yep.
A little bit. So all I have to say is, oh, you sweet summer child. And by that, I'm trying to be humorously say, yes, you can have laws on the books where you're not allowed to do X. And then people figure out how to accomplish X without doing X. And by that, I mean, hey, I'm a cop. I'm not allowed just to pull you over because of the way you look, but I'm going to pull you over because I saw you weave across the center line as you were driving down the highway, and now I have an excuse to pull you over. The same thing can happen with any situation. So yes, it is an achievement to pass such laws as the Civil Rights Act. I'm a big fan of that, and I think the Fair Housing Act is actually amendments to the Civil Rights Act. It's Title 8, 9, or 10, and whatever, but it's in that same ballpark, and I'm a big fan. But it's not like the day the Civil Rights Act passed, discriminatory acts ended in America. People will find reasons to kick this tenant out. They are so loud and noisy, Your Honor. we're getting complaints from the neighbors. They are disturbing the peace. They cohabitated, and that's against the lease, and et cetera, et cetera. Ryan, have you run into maybe not the Fair Housing Act from a gender discrimination standpoint, but is there cases that you guys have seen where people were saying, "Hey, my landlord kicked me out because he is a Christian and I am a Muslim"?
You know, that's a good question. I don't know for a fact that we've gotten things relating to housing. I'd be kind of shocked if we haven't, but it hasn't come across my desk.
Mm-hmm.
The types of things that we do hear about are things like someone is incarcerated and wants to start an atheist book club, and they can't do that even though there's a Christian book club, and they're given the runaround forever about why this is, you know, and it's, unless you have an idiot government actor, like you said, they're going to just give you some justification and just keep coming up with them over and over again, rather than saying, well, we don't like this idea because of your belief or lack thereof, right? So as long as they don't say those magic words, it's really, really hard to make a case against it. And there's other hurdles too. So I think you correctly identified the main one, but there's also issues where, you know, HUD only has authority where there's federal funds involved. So you have to be able to show the connection between the federal funds and the enforcement going on. There's all these hurdles towards actually getting that enforcement. So it's just like, it sounds good on paper, but to actually enforce something like the Fair Housing Act is just much, much more tricky than you might think.
Yes, and keep in mind each state usually has its own copy of the Civil Rights Act, Fair Housing Act, those sorts of things where you will have a cause of action at the state level. Fair Housing Act is a federal level, as Ryan was pointing out, where you can also have some relief granted by the courts. But what does it look like, right? What does it look like? And you probably have, and this is just a generic sort of description of how these regimes are typically set up. You probably have some sort of administrative process that you have to go through. You have to file a complaint and you have to exhaust that entire process. And if you're not satisfied, then and only then can you file a lawsuit in court. And then you have to produce evidence. And at least in those venues, it's probably not a high level of evidence. It probably is just a preponderance of the evidence. And as long as you can convince some judge 3 years on that you were improperly evicted because you have videotapes of every night you were there and you have testimony from 28 reputable people and all of that stuff, then maybe you can win and you've been out of the house for 2-3 years or whatever. Now, that said, that's a cynical view. A lot of housing disputes, at least in local venues, are accelerated. Anytime you're going to get you need to evict somebody as a landlord, typically you will go before a judge within like 60 to 90 days, not waiting 2 or 3 years. But yeah, my short answer is, oh, you sweet summer child. Yes. Just because there's a law in the books doesn't mean that devious people will find ways around it all the time. And it's important to have the laws on the book, but it's also important to have friends and family, develop a record through paperwork, video, photo, all of that sort of stuff, so that if you do either want to stand on principle and fight the long fight, or if it comes down to an immediate sort of action where there's some sort of police involvement, you've got evidence. Because the person without evidence, it comes down to a he said, she said, and the institution is, unfortunately, I have dealt with landlord-tenant disputes before, and the institution tends to trust the landlords more than the tenants, especially in lower income housing.
Yeah, these are good fights to have if you have the capacity to fight them.
Yeah, exactly. I'm rewatching the TV series Veep, which is a fictional account of Julia Louis-Dreyfus plays a vice president who aspires to be president. And there is a moment with a representative and his aide, and he's trying to punish his aide and insult him and tell him he's really slow. And he says something along the lines of, "You move as slowly as a Mississippi detective investigating the murder of a young black man."
Damn.
And it's a funny line. And it's so many times in comedy, it's funny because there's this very big core of truth, and it's very related to what you're talking about. The housing authority in the local area will move as slowly as they want to, based on whatever their own personal prejudices are.